Welcome to The Breakdown, where we dive deep into the stories shaping our world. I'm Alex Carter, your host, and today we're diving into a truly fascinating development in the world of international sports. We are discussing plans for the 2026 Winter Olympics in Italy.
Hey everyone, I'm Taylor Morgan, and I've got to say, Alex, this is one of those stories that really shows just how complex hosting the Olympics can be.
It absolutely does, Taylor. We're looking at a situation where Italy's construction timeline for the Games is raising some serious concerns, and New York has emerged as this potential backup host. I mean, this is pretty unprecedented, right?
Oh, it's completely unprecedented for a backup location to be named this close to the Games, you know? And what makes it even more interesting is that we're talking about moving the Games across an entire ocean, it really shows the scale of what we're dealing with here.
Today we're going to break down exactly what's happening with the construction delays in Italy, why New York might be the solution, and what this could mean for the future of the Olympics. So, Taylor, let's get into what's actually happening on the ground. In Italy, what's causing all these concerns about the construction timeline?
Well, you see, the main issue right now is the bobsled track in Cortina. They're really struggling with this one. The original contractor actually pulled out of the project last year, and they still haven't managed to break ground on what's supposed to be a pretty complex piece of Olympic infrastructure.
So, we're talking about a major venue that hasn't even started construction yet?
Exactly, and it's not just the bobsled track. The Olympic Village in Cortina is facing significant delays too. I mean, these are absolutely critical facilities that need to be ready well before the athletes arrive.
Tell me more about the specific timeline issues they're facing.
So, the thing is, most Olympic venues need to be completed at least 6 months before the Games to allow for proper testing and what we call test events. But right now, several venues are nowhere near that timeline. The speed skating oval in Bosselga di Pinei, for instance, they're dealing with massive cost overruns, construction delays.
And how does this compare to the normal preparation timeline for Winter Olympics?
Oh, this is way behind where they should be. Typically at this point, and I've studied Olympic preparations for years, host cities should be in the final stages of construction. But instead, we're seeing major components that are still basically on the drawing board.
What about the existing facilities? I understand some venues were already in place.
Right. So that's actually one of the few bright spots. The skiing venues in places like Val di Fiemme are mostly ready because they're existing facilities that just needed upgrades. But the problem is that these Winter Games were planned as a multi-city event across northern Italy, and all the new construction, that's where we're seeing these really serious delays.
So, from what you're saying, it sounds like the infrastructure connecting these venues is also a concern?
Absolutely. And that's honestly one of the biggest challenges. They needed to upgrade several mountain roads and build new transport links between venues. And you know what's particularly concerning? The weather conditions in the Alps mean they have a very limited construction season. So every delay just compounds the problem.
Let's talk about New York as this potential backup host. What makes it a viable option for something this massive?
Well, New York is actually pretty well positioned for this kind of emergency situation. I mean, first of all, Lake Placid, and this is fascinating, it's already hosted the Winter Olympics twice, in 1932 and 1980. And the really interesting thing is that they've maintained and upgraded a lot of those facilities.
What specific venues are we talking about here?
So, Lake Placid has this incredible Olympic infrastructure. There's the Olympic Center, which includes multiple ice rinks, and they've got the Olympic jumping complex that was just renovated in 2021. The bobsled and luge tracks are fully operational and regularly host international competitions.
But would Lake Placid alone be enough?
Oh no, definitely not. What makes this plan interesting is that it would really be a regional effort. You see, Whiteface Mountain could handle the alpine events, but we'd likely need to utilize venues across the state. Like, the indoor events could be split between Albany and even New York City proper.
Tell me about the accommodation situation. How would New York handle all these athletes and spectators?
That's actually one of New York's strongest advantages. I mean, unlike Lake Placid in 1980, we're looking at this massive hotel infrastructure throughout the region. And the transportation network is it's just so much more developed than what Italy's struggling with right now.
What would need to happen to get everything ready on short notice, though?
Well, that's where it gets really interesting. The biggest challenge would be upgrading some of the existing venues to meet current Olympic standards. Like, some of the facilities would need modern media infrastructure, enhanced seating capacity, and updated athlete facilities.
And the time frame for all this?
Typically you'd want years to prepare, but New York has this unique advantage where most of the heavy lifting, the major construction work, it's already done. We're talking about modifications and upgrades rather than building from scratch, which is it's just so much more manageable in a compressed timeline.
So it sounds like New York might actually be better prepared than people might think.
Absolutely. And there's one more crucial factor here: experience. The region has this deep pool of event management expertise. I mean, they regularly host major international winter sports competitions, and that operational knowledge, that's absolutely invaluable when you're working with such a tight timeline.
Now, let's get into what might be the most crucial part here: the logistical challenges of actually making this switch. What are we looking at in terms of the sheer complexity of moving an Olympics?
Oh man, this is where things get really complicated. I mean, we're talking about an absolutely massive undertaking that would need to happen in, and this is crucial, a matter of months rather than years. First off, there's the whole broadcasting infrastructure that's already been planned for Italy, and all of that would need to be completely reconfigured for New York's venues,
What about the economic side of things?
right? So the financial implications are they're staggering. You're looking at, well, billions of dollars that have already been committed in Italy. And then there's the question of who would actually foot the bill for this emergency relocation. I mean, you've got contracts with sponsors, TV rights that were negotiated specifically for European time zones, and all of that would need to be renegotiated.
So, what would the timeline actually look like for making this decision?
Well, that's probably the most challenging aspect. We're talking about a decision that really needs to be made within the next few months. Because even with New York's existing infrastructure, you'd need at least 6 to 8 months to coordinate everything. I mean, you've got to think about security arrangements, volunteer recruitment, and just the sheer logistics of moving all the athletic delegations.
Tell me more about those security arrangements.
So, security is it's absolutely massive. You're looking at coordinating between local law enforcement, state police, federal agencies, and international security teams. And remember, in Italy, they've been planning these security protocols for years. To shift all of that to New York, it's mind-boggling, really.
What about the athletes themselves? How would this impact their preparations?
That's actually a really critical point. Athletes have been training with specific venues in mind, right? They've been studying the Italian courses, the altitude, the typical weather conditions, and suddenly they'd have to completely readjust their training programs. Plus, think about all the teams that have already secured accommodation, training facilities in Italy. All of that would need to be completely reworked.
Are there any other major hurdles we haven't touched on?
Oh, absolutely. There's the whole diplomatic aspect. I mean, you've got to consider the international relations impact. Italy would face this massive embarrassment on the world stage, and then there's the question of how this affects future Olympic bids. Plus, you've got thousands of existing contracts with vendors, with service providers, with local businesses, and each one of those would need to be either terminated or somehow transferred to New York.
You know, this whole situation reminds me of other Olympic shakeups we've seen in the past. Taylor, what precedents do we have for something like this?
Well, actually, this isn't the first time the Olympics has faced major location challenges. I mean, the most recent example that comes to mind is the 2022 Winter Olympics. Before Beijing was selected, several European cities they completely withdrew their bids due to cost concerns and lack of public support.
So, we've seen cities back out before. Has there ever been a case where a host city had to be changed after being selected?
Yes, and it's fascinating, actually. The most dramatic example was back in 1976. Denver was originally supposed to host the Winter Olympics, and And this is incredible. They actually won the bid and then had to back out in 1972. The games ended up being moved to Innsbruck, Austria, which had just hosted in 1964 and still had all the facilities.
That's quite a shift. How did they manage it?
The key was really that Innsbruck had this existing infrastructure, right? They'd just hosted 12 years earlier, so everything was still basically there. And that's actually really relevant to our current situation because New York has a lot of existing venues and infrastructure that could be repurposed quickly.
Tell me about some more recent examples of Olympic challenges.
So, more recently, we saw some serious concerns around the 2016 Rio Olympics. Now, they didn't end up moving those games, but there were some really serious discussions about contingency plans because of construction delays and the Zika virus outbreak and, various other challenges. And then, of course, we can't forget about the 2020 Tokyo Olympics, which faced this unprecedented situation with COVID-19.
What lessons can we take from these past experiences?
The biggest lesson is that successful transitions require three key things. First, you need a backup location with existing infrastructure, which, and this is important, New York actually has. Second, you need really strong political will and public support. And third, and this is crucial, you need enough time to make the switch. I mean, looking at Innsbruck in '76, they had about 4 years to prepare, not just a few months like we're talking about now.
So, how does our current situation compare to these historical examples?
We're in somewhat uncharted territory here because the timeline is it's so much more compressed than anything we've seen before. I mean, even the COVID postponement of Tokyo 2020, which was this huge deal, they had a full year to reorganize. What we're looking at now with New York as a potential plan B, it's unprecedented in terms of the time frame.
Looking at this situation, I can't help but think about the massive economic implications. Taylor, what kind of financial impact are we looking at for both Italy and New York?
Oh, this is actually really fascinating because we're looking at this sort of, double-edged sword situation. For Italy, we're talking about billions of euros already invested in construction and infrastructure. And the thing is, if they lose the Olympics, they'll still have these half-finished venues that they've poured money into, right?
Oh, so Italy would take a significant financial hit?
Absolutely massive. I mean, you've got direct construction costs, but then there's all these contracts with suppliers, hospitality businesses that have been preparing, tourism expectations that have been built into local economies. And the really tricky part is that a lot of these investments were made with the Olympics as the justification,
And what about New York's side of the equation?
Well, that's where things get really interesting because New York actually has this unique advantage. They've got so much existing infrastructure that could be repurposed quickly. But still, we're talking about significant costs for rapid mobilization, security arrangements, and just the sheer logistics of it all.
How would the political dynamics play into this?
Oh, this is where it gets really complex. First, you've got the Italian government, which would face enormous domestic pressure if they lost the Olympics. I mean, we're talking about potential political fallout that could reshape their whole political landscape.
So there are serious implications for Italy's leadership?
Absolutely. But it's not just Italy. You've got the IOC trying to maintain its credibility, you've got international relations to consider, and then there's the whole question of how this affects future Olympic bids. Because, if cities see this kind of situation play out, they might become even more hesitant to bid for future games.
Tell me about the stakeholders involved in a potential transition.
Right. So we're looking at this incredibly complex web of interests. You've got the athletes who need certainty about where they'll be competing. You've got sponsors who've invested millions in marketing campaigns specific to Italy. And then there's the broadcast networks who've already made all their technical plans for Italian venues.
How might this affect international relations between the U.S. and Italy?
That's actually one of the most delicate aspects of this whole situation. It's not just about sports anymore. It's about diplomatic relationships and national pride. Italy would likely see this as a major embarrassment on the world stage, and even if New York steps in as a sort of rescue option, there could be some diplomatic tension there.
What roles are the respective governments playing in these discussions?
So both federal governments are actually being very careful in their public statements. The U.S. government is trying to position this as being ready to help if needed, while still respecting Italy's role as the host. And the Italian government is trying to project confidence while quietly working with Olympic officials to assess all options.
Looking at the timeline ahead, what are the critical decisions that need to be made in the coming months?
Right. So this is really crucial because we're working with some seriously tight deadlines here. The IOC has basically set this sort of unofficial deadline of June, you know? That's when they need to make the final call on whether Italy can pull this off or if they need to activate this Plan B with New York.
What specific benchmarks need to be hit before June?
Well, there are these really critical construction milestones that Italy needs to meet. First off, they've got to show significant progress on the main Olympic village by April. And then there's the bobsled track. That's actually one of the biggest concerns right now. They need to have that at least 70% complete by May, and honestly, that's looking pretty challenging based on current progress.
So, what happens if these benchmarks aren't met?
That's when things get really interesting because the IOC would need to trigger this whole transition process. We're talking about an absolutely massive undertaking. New York would need to immediately begin their operational planning. And the thing is, they've actually already started some preliminary work behind the scenes, just to be prepared.
What would the first steps of that transition look like?
The first thing that needs to happen is this rapid assessment of New York's venues. Even though they've got a lot of existing infrastructure, they'd need to quickly confirm which locations would host which events. Then there's this whole massive coordination effort with security, with transportation, with accommodation providers. And all of this needs to happen while maintaining this really delicate diplomatic balance with Italy.
What's the absolute latest point a decision could be made?
The real drop-dead deadline is September, but honestly, waiting that long would be incredibly risky because you've got all these teams and athletes who need to know where they're going to be competing. And every day of delay just makes the logistics more complicated and more expensive.
After diving deep into this fascinating situation, it's clear that we're looking at a really complex and unprecedented scenario with the 2026 Winter Olympics.
Absolutely. And what really stands out to me is just how delicate this whole situation is. We've got Italy pushing to complete these massive construction projects, and then there's New York essentially waiting in the wings as this backup plan.
What do you think is the most likely outcome here?
Well, based on everything we've discussed, I'd say there's a real possibility we might see this backup plan activated. The construction delays in Italy are significant, and with those June deadlines approaching, it's going to be, incredibly challenging for them to catch up. But I have to emphasize that New York really is prepared for this scenario.
Thanks for breaking this down so thoroughly, Taylor. Any final thoughts for our listeners?
Yeah, I think the key takeaway is that while this situation is certainly unusual, the Olympic movement is showing real adaptability here. Having a solid Plan B with New York just makes sense, and it's actually quite reassuring to see this level of preparation.
That brings us to the end of today's episode of The Breakdown. We'll be keeping a close eye on developments, and we'll make sure to bring you updates as this story continues to unfold. Thanks for listening, everyone. We'll catch you next time.